Good evening. Tonight we have a few spooky stories I wanted to share with you folks. I have three stories. One of them I heard years ago from an old coworker. The other two were more recently in the last couple years. I've all heard them firsthand from the people who reported them. Now I will say, trying not to embellish or add anything to these stories, I'm trying to give them to you pretty much exactly as I heard them. But I will say I've changed the locations and names and maybe condense some events that happened over months. But for the most part, these stories are 100% true. I believe the people who told them. The people expressed fear, and I wanted to share them with you folks tonight to get us to kind of in the Halloween mood, more or less. So the first story was Bill. I talked to Bill a little over a year ago. And what's very striking is this story is very similar to some older stories that I had heard on Sasquatch Chronicles, and he had no idea what that was. He wasn't a Bigfoot researcher, but he wasn't stupid. He realized that him and his wife had bought this old farm property in the Deep South. The lady who had it before him, she lived there for a couple months on her home and then went into like a hospice type care. I guess she went downhill really fast after her husband died. And when she left the house pretty much immediately, this older lady. Like dishes in the sink, stuff still in the refrigerator, fully furnished, like packed up some clothes in a suitcase and had her kids come pick her up. And her kids said that she was starting to get Alzheimer's and she lived out her life in an assisted living place and passed away. The kids all lived very far away. So this farmhouse in the property became very dilapidated, and Bill and his wife bought it. They wanted it as a fixer-up program. Bill is a professional. He works late nights, and he was still working. This was at the end of his career, but he figured he'd spend the last couple of years of his life commuting and working late. His kids were grown and out of the house, so it was just him and his wife ready to enjoy the simple life in the farmland and pretty much enjoy their retirement. So Bill immediately started noticing this was a strange property. The barn had, big items in it tipped over, and he couldn't explain how some of these items had been moved. There were also lots of stick structures around the house that he was finding, stuff that looked like blinds all around the property for watching the house. And he was hearing tree knocks. He was hearing strange whoops that didn't sound like any birds he had ever heard before. And he would swear he'd get the feeling of being watched when he was out there all the time. The hair would stand up on his neck. So he would also be doing a lot of work in this barn. There was a tractor and some farm equipment stuff in there, and he had to get all the farm equipment running so he could cut the grass, work on the road that was in there. He generally just had a lot of work to do. His wife was very helpful. But he was still working. He was still working swing shifts in the occasional graveyard. So he would come home late, sleep in, get up in the afternoon, and work. It was about this time, after a few weeks, his wife was getting creeped out there by herself, and she knew how to use guns, and she was no pushover, but he got a couple of German Shepherds, I believe. I believe that's the type of dog he said. I think he said German Shepherds. He kind of said more or less police dogs. They could have been Belgian Malinois. Anyway, so he got a couple of dogs, well-trained dogs. He had, Bill was pretty well off, so he was able to afford some of those really well-trained dogs that you see out there as companions for his wife, and this made her feel a lot better because they would always be on high alert. They were, very quickly bonded to her and were always her protectors. So it was a few weeks later after he got the dogs, and he was getting used to having the dogs around, letting them out. They're pretty rambunctious, so on and off the leash training, that kind of stuff. But there really wasn't a whole lot else for them around except, deers and bushes and everything else. And speaking of deer, there were a lot of deer on the property, and he would occasionally find them dead at the edge of the property. And what he described was it looked like their necks were completely twisted around, or sometimes he'd find the head twisted off and find it 30, 40 feet away from the rest of the corpse. And the carcass would usually have its guts missing or pulled out, but like they were gone, but the meat and everything was there, and it looked like it wasn't done by scavengers. It looked like something, surgically extracted the guts, removed or ate the guts without a lot of mess. And he just found that was very odd. And, he did see the occasional coyote and things, Uh, but it was just generally very weird around the property. So one week, his wife was gone for a week visiting her sister, and he was working by himself, and he had the dogs out with him. He was going in and out of the barn and working on an old tractor. And quite often he would work late into the afternoon, and his wife would call his name, Bill, Bill, dinner's ready, Bill. So it was very odd one day that he finished working and was back in the house and was out on the porch. He grabbed a beer, sat down out there, and was kind of just enjoying the evening. And he hears a sound. And he hears a couple other sounds coming from the bushes. And when he stopped and heard it, he heard Bill, Bill. And it almost sounded like a wife's voice. And he described it as in the biggest, toughest dude you've ever seen in your life, like Andre the Giant trying to do an impression of his wife's voice, calling his name. And it was coming from the tree line. Well, he hopped up, grabbed his shotgun. It was dusk. He had a flashlight, and he kind of went out there to go investigate. The dogs that were always very on point, chasing everything, were very much cowering by his side and kind of whimpering. They were very much scared of what was going on. Now, Bill was no dummy. He kind of had a feeling that from what he had been seeing, what he had been hearing, that maybe there were Sasquatch on the property. He wasn't closed-minded to it. He was actually kind of fine with it. He didn't really care. Up until this point, they weren't really bothering him. He kind of had a suspicion. But he went out to go investigate his name calling because he thought, this has got to be somebody screwing with me. This isn't Bigfoot. Is this place haunted? And as he's going to the tree line, he stops. He gets hit with this wall of fear about 30 or 40 feet from the tree line. And he hears a knock behind him, like a tree knock, coming from, kind of like 170 or 180 degrees away from where the voices were calling him. And he turns around and he sees a giant Sasquatch standing in the darkness of this tree line. It ducks behind a tree. Just at this point, he hears another tree knock from across the yard, and he sees movement on the other side of the yard. He hears something else calling his name, and he felt that that was something sending a message that you're not welcome here, or that it was an ambush. And he can only just imagine his wife being there by himself. At this point, he backed up to the house. And apparently his wife, when he had been gone, had similar circumstances of hearing her name or the dog's name being called out there, and all sorts of weird hoops and hollers and the 800-pound owl thing. And it started off as mundane curiosity, and these Sasquatch slowly got more and more aggressive, looking in their windows, thumping on the house. It seems like the more he cut the yard and the more they cleaned the place up and the more work they did and the more lights they put out, the more aggressive these creatures became. So eventually they couldn't take it anymore. They didn't think anybody was going to believe them. Bill, still having a professional career, just said that country life wasn't working out for him and his wife, and they sold the property. And he came across my channel a while ago, and he wanted to share that story with me. And it always really stuck with me. I can just kind of imagine it. Somebody who spends time in the woods at an older property, I just picture it in my mind, and I wanted to share that first story with you guys. The second story I want to share with you folks tonight was by my old coworker John. This was probably shared with me in 2007 or so. And he was in the military. He was still active at the time, getting ready to retire. And he was lifelong military. He'd been in for 25 years or something like by that point. He was working graveyard with me in security. And he said he was stationed at a military base. I believe it was on the East Coast somewhere, kind of further south. And when he was a young man, I believe he might not even have been like 20 or 21 years old. Anyway, he was stationed on this base. It was kind of out in the country. It was kind of a little more of a remote base, and there was a small town nearby. He said he didn't have a car at the time, but he would go for long walks. He would walk into town, have dinner, get a couple drinks, go to the store, and walk back to the base. He says it was very common for a lot of these guys. So one night, he got out there a little bit later than usual, and he was like, oh crap, it's dark. So he started off when it was just getting dark, and by the time he was on his way back to the base, I guess it was a good few miles. And all along the road going back to the base was this tree line. It was kind of trees on either side. It was kind of your classic, 2-lane blacktop with a ditch, and then about, 15, 20 feet, and then trees. And this was your classic East Coast, really dense kind of woods. And he's walking along this road, and he can hear something in the tree line. And he's like, oh, it's probably a deer. It's nighttime. And although the crickets, he says it was very eerily quiet. He said, normally when he's out in his area, he hears crickets, he hears raccoons, he hears all sorts of stuff rustling around in the bushes. And he says it was eerily quiet this night, except for something that was kind of going, he kept hearing periodically off to his right. And he would kind of look over, and before you know it, he's kind of walking more on the left side of the road because this noise is following him. And he starts walking a little faster, and this noise is following him, and it sounds like it's on 2 feet. And whatever it is, it's sounding really big. And he could hear the occasional branch snap, and then he would hear it stop for a second, then he would hear thump, 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 like it was running to catch up. And then at a certain point, he's walking really fast, not wanting to jog because he's got kind of his heart's beating, but he knows if he runs, he doesn't want to trigger anything. He doesn't think it's a bear. He doesn't think it's a human because no human could run through these woods at night. I mean, during the day, you would be, hard-pressed to move this thing. But whatever it is, it's big, and it's following him. So at one point, he hears the footsteps go from the bushes behind him to what sounds like grass, and then the gravel, and then he hears footsteps run across the road. Just as he turns around, he doesn't have a flashlight or anything on him. He says it's really dark, but there is some moonlight, and he can kind of see what's going on. So just as he sees through the moonlight, he can kind of barely make out the figure of a person running across the road. The thing is, this person was huge. Very broad shoulders, much taller than him, moved incredibly smooth like a ghost. It was like a black blur headed through the night. This huge, upright, walking blur ran behind him. He caught just a glimpse of it, and he could hear it skitter off into the gravel and then back into the woods on the other side of the road. At this point, John told me that he was in a full panic and that he was in pretty much a jog headed back to the base. This was a while back. He didn't have a flashlight or a phone or anything on him. And he started with a trot up to the gate of the military base. And right as he did, the guard at the military base, who he recognized and knew, he held out his ID and said, "Hey, I'm coming back in." And the guard from the military base pulled out his service rifle, pointed it towards the bushes, and said, "You didn't see anything tonight. You best be getting back to your barracks." He showed him his ID, which the guy didn't even look at, he said, and he went back to his barracks and had a very unrestless night. And I just thought it was very fascinating. Now, he tells me in retrospect that he thinks it might have been a Bigfoot. I think it might even have been a dog man. But yeah, that's very frightening. The fact that when the guard or the person manning the front gate had his rifle pointed as soon as he came running in and saw what was going on and told him you didn't see anything tonight, made it really sound like he knew what was going on. And he didn't ask any further questions. He didn't bring it up. But he definitely didn't go walking into town by himself anymore. It had been a long night for Chris. It had been a long day. He had been working all day. He had to drive up the hill to the mountains where his house was. And he was unloading the car. He made a little dinner. And he went back outside because it was just such a nice warm summer night. In the mountains, you got a little bit of crisp air coming in. And he sat on the tailgate of his truck, having a cigarette. And what he noticed across the road, across the street from him, absolutely dumbfounded Chris. He saw what looked like something about the size of a beach ball, but all white and had kind of a yellowish white light coming from it. Just like this orb of light, like somebody carrying a beach ball very smoothly, right through the trees, right along the side of the road in a little mountain community that he lived in. He didn't know what it was. He was blinking his eyes. He could see it clearly, but he wasn't sure. Am I looking at a headlight or a reflection? I don't know what that is. I don't know what's going on. As soon as this light passed away, he noticed a very large creature come up right the same path that this light was coming up. He sat there dumbfounded at the light, watching this huge, giant, hairy figure that he could only describe as a Sasquatch, trotting behind the same path that this orb of light had taken. It moved over, took a quick glance over at him, and kept moving, moving very smoothly, very quickly through these trees, barely making a sound. At this point, Chris was quite taken back. Not only did he see a Sasquatch, which isn't completely uncommon in the mountain community where he was in, but he saw this strange orb of light. And there are many stories that are connected like this, is just why I think Chris's story is really incredible. And I completely believe him, but fortunately he did get ridiculed quite a bit for this story. And you never know what's going on with the paranormal. You never know how these different subjects tie together. And if you like what you hear, please give this video a thumbs up. It helps me out a lot. Please hit subscribe if you haven't already. We've kind of slowed down how many videos we're putting out, but at least once a week you guys will have something to watch and listen to. Thank you very much. Stay safe in the woods. And if you got a Bigfoot encounter you want to share with me, email me at mattsquatchpresents@gmail.com. And always keep your eyes out, folks.